The first thing the paramedic noticed wasn't the silence, it was how the house seemed to be holding its breath, as if it already knew what the hallway would reveal. Ethan Moore lived in a small, sagging home at the edge of town where the streetlights didn't quite reach. In daylight, it looked like any other place a couple might start over: peeling paint, a narrow garden, a porch with a chair that leaned to one side. But inside, Ethan and his partner, Claire Dawson, moved through their days like guests who'd overstayed a welcome they never asked for. Because the house didn't belong to them anymore. Not really. It belonged to Mason Crowe. Mason arrived the way people like him always did, casually, confidently, with a smile that made others feel chosen. At first, he was help. He'd bring groceries when Ethan's benefits didn't stretch far enough. He'd pay for a takeaway and tell Ethan not to worry about it. He'd fix a broken latch, patch a window, handle a landlord's complaint with a quick phone call and an easy laugh. Ethan was vulnerable in the quiet, ordinary ways that rarely make headlines. He struggled with anxiety, found paperwork overwhelming, and hated conflict so much that even a raised voice made him flinch. Claire loved him for his gentleness, his instinct to apologize even when he'd done nothing wrong. She was the steadier one, the person who wrote reminders on the calendar and coaxed him outside when the world felt too sharp. Mason learned all of that within weeks. Then the favors became debts. The groceries became, "You owe me." The repairs became, "I keep this place standing." And Ethan's money, small, carefully budgeted, became something Mason tracked with the attention of a banker and the entitlement of a thief. Mason didn't ask for Ethan's bank card. He just took it, the same way he took Ethan's phone when a message came in, the same way he took the remote, the front door key, the best chair in the living room. He set rules like they were jokes. Who could speak when? When Ethan could go out. What Claire was allowed to wear if she didn't want trouble. He didn't need to raise his fist every day. Most days, a look was enough. Neighbors began to notice the rhythm of it. Mason turning up at odd hours. Ethan trailing behind him, shoulders rounded, eyes down. Claire stiff as a wire whenever Mason was nearby, her smile too quick, too practiced. Once, at the corner shop, Mason spoke to Ethan like he was a pet that had made a mess, loud enough for people to hear, cheerful enough to sound almost normal. "Come on," Mason said, clapping Ethan's shoulder hard. "Don't be useless. You know what you're doing." Ethan laughed when he was supposed to. The sound didn't reach his eyes. Claire tried, in small ways, to push back. She suggested changing the locks. Mason heard about it before she even finished the sentence. After that, he started dropping by more often, just to remind them he could. He'd sit in their living room with his feet up, scrolling on his phone, while Ethan hovered near the doorway like a nervous employee waiting for instructions. "Police won't help you," Mason would say, almost kindly, like a piece of advice. "And you don't want the kind of attention they bring. Trust me." Ethan believed him. Or maybe Ethan just believed in avoiding catastrophe by any means necessary. By the time summer turned toward autumn, the home had become a stage for Mason's control. Ethan woke when Mason wanted. Ethan paid when Mason demanded. Ethan apologized when Mason was angry, even if he didn't understand why. And Claire, watching it happen day after day, began to feel something cold and heavy settling in her chest. Not only fear, but the creeping certainty that Mason wasn't just passing through their lives. He was moving in. And he wasn't leaving. The night everything began to unravel started like so many others, with Mason deciding what they would do. It was a Friday, damp and overcast, the kind of evening where the sky pressed low over the rooftops. Mason announced they were going out, already pulling on his jacket as if the decision had never been up for discussion. Ethan hesitated, his fingers twisting together, a familiar knot forming in his stomach. "I'm tired," Ethan said softly. "Maybe we could just stay in." Mason's smile didn't fade. It sharpened. "Tired of what?" he asked, leaning in close enough that Ethan could smell the alcohol on his breath. "You've done nothing all day." Claire stepped in quickly, her voice light but careful. "We can go for one drink." "Just one." Mason studied her for a moment, then nodded. "One," he agreed. "See? Easy." The pub was loud and crowded, music thudding through the floorboards, glasses clinking, laughter spilling into the street every time the door opened. Mason thrived in places like this. He slapped backs, told stories, made himself the center of attention. Ethan sat beside him, nursing the same drink long after the ice had melted, flinching every time Mason raised his voice. At one point, Ethan stood to go to the restroom. Mason watched him go, eyes narrowed. "Don't wander," Mason called after him. A few heads turned. Ethan's ears burned as he nodded and hurried away. When he came back, Mason was annoyed, about what, Ethan never quite knew. Words followed. Then a shove that looked playful to anyone not paying close attention. Ethan stumbled into the table, laughter bursting out of him too quickly, too loud. "Careful," Mason said, gripping his arm. "You're clumsy tonight." Claire saw the way Ethan's face drained of color. She saw the way Mason's fingers dug in, just enough to leave a message. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Experience had taught her that public scenes only made things worse later. They didn't stay long. Outside, the air was cold and wet, the street slick with rain. Mason walked ahead, keys jangling, while Ethan lagged behind, his steps uneven. By the time they reached the house, the pub felt like a lifetime ago, an echo already fading. Inside, the tension didn't dissipate. It thickened. Mason paced the living room, energy buzzing off him. He accused Ethan of embarrassing him, of making him look foolish. Ethan tried to explain, words tumbling over each other, apologies stacked on apologies. "I didn't mean, I wasn't trying to, I'm sorry." Claire stood near the doorway, her heart pounding. She recognized the signs now, the restless movement, the clipped tone, the way Mason's gaze kept flicking to the room as if measuring it. "Go to bed," she said carefully. "We can talk in the morning." Mason stopped pacing. He turned slowly, smiling again, but this time, it didn't reach his eyes. "No," he said. "We're talking now." Ethan looked at Claire, fear naked on his face. She took a step toward him. That was when Mason shoved the chair aside. The sound was sharp, violent, echoing off the walls. Ethan flinched so hard he nearly fell. Mason closed the distance between them in 2 strides, his voice low and furious, words spilling out too fast to follow. Neighbors later said they heard shouting. A thud. Then another. Inside the house, time fractured. The living room became chaos, raised voices, furniture scraping, something heavy striking something soft. Claire screamed Ethan's name, her voice breaking as she tried to pull Mason back. At some point, Ethan ended up on the floor. At some point, there was blood. When the front door finally slammed shut, Mason stormed out into the night, breathing hard, his jacket darkened at the sleeves. He didn't look back. Minutes later, shaking, crying, barely able to dial, Claire called for help. When emergency services arrived, they found Ethan Moore lying in the hallway, unmoving, the house around him marked by signs of a violence no one could mistake. And yet, the story they were given would try to do exactly that. Blue lights washed over the front of the house, cutting through the rain and the dark like a warning. Paramedics moved quickly, their boots leaving wet prints across the threshold as they followed Claire's shaking directions down the narrow hallway. Ethan lay on his side near the coat rack, one arm bent beneath him, his face turned toward the wall. There was blood on the floor, on the skirting boards, on the doorframe, too much of it, spreading in thin, uneven trails that told a story before anyone spoke a word. They tried anyway. Claire stood in the living room, wrapped in a blanket, her teeth chattering. Through tears, she told officers that Ethan had been attacked earlier that night at the pub. She said he'd come home hurt, confused, insisting he was fine. She said he must have collapsed later. It was the explanation Mason had given her before he left. Short. Certain. Delivered like instructions. But the house didn't agree. A paramedic knelt beside Ethan, then slowly looked up and shook his head. Another scanned the hallway, then the living room beyond it, where a chair lay on its side and the coffee table sat at an odd angle, one leg twisted. An officer stepped carefully into the living room and stopped. The carpet was dark in places it shouldn't have been. Not spilled drink dark. Not tracked in mud dark. This was something else, wide, irregular staining that soaked deep into the fibers. The walls told the same story, faint but unmistakable marks reaching higher than they should have. This didn't happen at a pub, he said quietly. Forensics were called before dawn. As the house filled with professionals, each moving deliberately, the false narrative began to crumble. There was no sign Ethan had been involved in a public incident severe enough to explain his injuries. No witnesses. No reports. No footage from the pub that matched the claim. Instead, every path led back inside. The living room became the focus. Investigators documented everything: the displaced furniture, the damaged skirting board, the heavy staining consistent with repeated impacts in a confined space. The hallway, by comparison, told a quieter story, one of movement after the fact, not the source of what had happened. Neighbors were questioned as daylight crept in. One mentioned shouting late the night before. Another remembered seeing Mason Crowe storm out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle windows. He was always there, one neighbor said. Always telling them what to do. CCTV footage from nearby streets filled in the gaps. Mason and Ethan were seen together earlier that evening, Mason's body language sharp, controlling. Later footage showed Mason leaving the house alone, moving fast, checking over his shoulder. The timing was tight. Too tight. By the afternoon, what had first been treated as a sudden medical emergency was officially something else. The house was sealed. The tone shifted. Officers stopped asking what happened and started asking who did this. Mason Crowe was no longer just a name in the background. He was now the center of a growing circle of evidence. And he knew it. By the time the house was cleared and sealed, Mason Crowe was already on the move. Detectives learned quickly that Mason didn't have a fixed address. He drifted between friends, short-term rentals, and places where people asked few questions. It fit the pattern they were beginning to see: a man who embedded himself into other people's lives, then hollowed them out from the inside. Police moved fast. Uniformed officers were sent to known associates while detectives reviewed hours of CCTV footage frame by frame. On one camera, Mason was captured walking away from Ethan's home just minutes before the emergency call was placed. His stride was tense, his shoulders hunched. He kept adjusting his sleeves. That detail stayed with them. Less than 24 hours after Ethan was found, officers located Mason at a small apartment on the other side of town. He didn't resist when they knocked. He didn't ask why. He just stared straight ahead as he was handcuffed, his expression flat, almost bored. In interview, Mason said nothing. He sat back in his chair, arms folded, eyes fixed on a spot just above the detective's head. Question after question was met with silence. No denial. No explanation. No concern. The clock ticked loudly in the room, filling the space where words should have been. While Mason refused to talk, his surroundings did not. A search of the apartment uncovered clothing hidden deep inside a bin liner, shoved beneath a stack of boxes. The items matched what Mason had been wearing on camera the night before: same jacket, same shoes. Dark staining marked the fabric in irregular patches. Forensic teams were called immediately. Back at Ethan's house, another discovery added weight to the case. In the bedroom, investigators noticed damage to the bed frame, one section partially dismantled, the fixings loose, as if something had been hastily removed. The missing piece was heavy, solid, and the right size to explain the injuries documented by the medical examiner. They never found it. But they didn't need to. Fast-tracked forensic testing began to paint a clear picture. Patterns in the living room showed repeated impacts from the same object, delivered in close succession. Blood traces found on Mason's clothing matched Ethan. Microscopic transfer evidence placed Mason inside the room during the assault, not just present, but active. The timeline tightened. The evidence aligned. Each new result closed another door Mason might have slipped through. Within days, the charge was authorized. Mason Crowe was formally accused of ending Ethan Moore's life. For Claire, the news came as both relief and devastation. She sat in a quiet room at the station, hands clasped tightly together, replaying every moment she hadn't spoken up, every night she told herself they just needed to get through one more day. Investigators assured her of one thing: this hadn't been invisible. The control. The public humiliation. The fear. It had all left a trail. And now, finally, that trail was leading somewhere solid. The courtroom was quiet in the way only serious places ever are, a silence heavy with expectation, broken only by the shuffle of papers and the low murmur of voices being hushed. Mason Crowe sat at the defense table, expression unreadable, hands folded neatly in front of him. He had shaved. He wore a clean shirt. To someone who didn't know the case, he could have looked almost ordinary. The evidence made sure no one forgot who he was. Prosecutors laid out the story piece by piece, careful and methodical. They didn't rush. They didn't dramatize. They let the facts speak, knowing how loud they already were. They began with control. Witnesses described how Mason inserted himself into Ethan's life, how he managed money, dictated movements, spoke over him in public. Neighbors told the court about raised voices, intimidation disguised as jokes, the visible fear that clung to Ethan whenever Mason was nearby. CCTV footage followed. The jury watched Mason and Ethan together in the hours before Ethan's death. Mason walking ahead. Ethan trailing behind. The imbalance was visible even without sound. Then came the house. Forensic specialists explained how the living room told a different story than the one first reported. They showed diagrams, photographs, timelines. They described impact patterns, transfer evidence, and the clear indicators of repeated force within a confined space. This was not an incident that began elsewhere, one expert said calmly. It happened here. Clothing recovered from Mason's temporary residence was presented next. Testing confirmed it carried Ethan's blood. Microscopic traces placed Mason in direct contact during the assault. The defense challenged timelines. They questioned procedures. They suggested alternative explanations without ever naming one that fit. Mason did not take the stand. Throughout it all, Claire sat behind the prosecution team, hands clenched, eyes fixed forward. She listened as her life was reduced to exhibits and testimony, as the fear she'd lived with became something the court could finally see. When closing arguments came, the prosecution focused on one truth: this wasn't sudden. It wasn't random. It was the end point of sustained control, intimidation, and unchecked dominance. The jury didn't deliberate long. When they returned, the room held its breath. The verdict was delivered clearly, without hesitation. Guilty. Mason Crowe showed no reaction as the words settled into the air. No anger. No shock. Just a slow blink, as if confirming something he had already known. Sentencing followed soon after. The judge spoke of vulnerability, of trust abused, of a life systematically taken apart long before it ended. A life sentence was imposed, reflecting both the severity of the crime and the danger Mason posed. As he was led away, the room remained silent. Justice, at last, had found its voice. After the trial ended and the courtroom emptied, the house at the edge of town stood silent once more. The police tape was gone. The lights were off. From the outside, it looked like any other small home waiting for someone to return. But no one ever truly did. The walls held memories that couldn't be scrubbed away, and eventually the property was sold, its history reduced to paperwork and dates. For Claire, the world moved forward whether she was ready or not. She relocated quietly, carrying only what she needed. In the months that followed, she spoke with support workers who helped her understand something she had never been able to name before, that control does not always arrive screaming. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it convinces everyone in the room that nothing is wrong. She replayed the warning signs endlessly, the jokes that weren't jokes, the way Ethan stopped making decisions, the fear that became normal. And with time, she stopped blaming herself for surviving. Investigators later described the case as a clear example of how vulnerable people can disappear in plain sight. There were no locked doors. No chains. Just pressure, fear, and a man who knew exactly how far he could go without being challenged. Ethan's life was remembered by those who knew him best not for how it ended, but for who he was before control shrank his world. He was gentle. He was polite. He noticed small things, birds on fences, changes in the weather, the way music sounded better late at night. Those details mattered to him. Mason Crowe would spend the rest of his life behind walls he could not manipulate. No charm. No leverage. No one left to dominate. The case became part of training sessions, community awareness talks, quiet reminders that danger does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it moves in slowly, rearranges the furniture, and convinces everyone to look away. And that is the lesson Ethan Moore left behind. Not all harm is sudden. Not all victims are visible. And silence, when mistaken for peace, can be the most dangerous thing of all.